Thank you very much for having me. My talk will have a lot of similarities with Emma's. I was actually updating my talk as you were speaking all the time. That is no accident, of course. Emma, Claire, and I studied together at the Institute of Cognition and Culture. We were part of that first generation CSR 2.0 students, as I like to call it. 1.0 being some of the people present here who kickstarted the discipline, created the big theories, and then invited their students, some of my generation, to test those theories. And you mentioned how you wouldn't probably not be here without people like Bob, and that's definitely true for me. I started in religious studies. I was for a long time disappointed by the treatment of the topic of religion within religious studies. And I remember getting extremely excited by at least two talks that really changed the way I saw the study of religion. One of those talks was when Luther Martin visited the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. That must have been something like 22 years ago. That was the talk it was during that talk that I realized this is what I want to do. So in that talk, he mentioned your and Tom's theory and Harvey's theory, who later became my doctoral advisor. After that, that prompted me to go to Emory University to study in the cognitive science of religion. And it was there that I saw your talk. I was trying to remember when that was exactly. And I've determined that I met you about 20 years ago, which is slightly longer than I've known my wife. And that talk too was very inspirational for me, and I will get into that. So I'm very happy to be here. Bob, I've said this before, but I consider you to be a sort of mentor for me. And that really says something because we've never coincided at an academic institution for more than a conference. You haven't been my professor. We haven't collaborated on any kind of empirical project. But every time I've met you and I met with you, I learned something. So you have been a teacher for me. So before I get into my talk, I'd like to tell you a few things that I've learned from Bob McCauley. And I will keep it to no more than 4 slides. So the first thing I learned is that opportunism is a good thing. So that talk I saw you give at Emory University, you talked about interdisciplinarity. You talked about the importance of explanatory pluralism and multi-level explanation. And that, to me, was something self-evident, but this was not what people around me were doing, certainly in my undergraduate studies. And your call to just be driven by your questions and then seek out whatever methodologies are available and appropriate for testing those questions, that really resonated with me. And I often start my classes with that kind of spiel to this day. Another thing I learned from you is not to use the P word loosely. It was shortly after meeting Bob for the first time that I sent him an email. And I asked him, what would it take to definitively prove your theory? And Bob sent me what I can only describe as a rant. It was about 3 pages long about the P word. In science, there's no proof. Proof is something we find in mathematics and formal logic. Science is about the accumulation of evidence that can suggest particular directions, and we're always open to reevaluating our claims on the basis of new evidence. To this day, if any of my students dare mention the P word in my classes, they get the whole same rant that you gave me. So thank you for that. Another lesson that I've learned from you has to do with epistemic humility. And that was when I published a paper many years ago. And you emailed me asking me to send you that paper. And you said specifically in your email that you wanted to use that paper in your lectures because it went against your theory, not for your theory. And I think that's something I've always gotten from you, your deep respect for the scientific process and your epistemic humility. And the fourth thing that I learned from you is that you can never have enough ease. People have already alluded to this, but that first talk that I heard from you, that was when you mentioned your colleague, Larry Barcelo and Antonio Damasio, and people who were talking about embodiment. I had never heard of the word embodiment before. In the cognitive science of religion, this is something that has, at a theoretical level, resonated with a lot of people, although few people have actually pursued that kind of research. So in essence, a 4E view of cognition looks at cognition as embedded in particular social contexts, as extended beyond individual minds, as enacted, and this is something that as a scholar of ritual, I find particularly important. And of course, it is embodied. The raw physical experience of participation is fundamentally different than what a brain in a vat would have if it were to take part in some religious ritual. And recently you wrote something that again resonated with me. You said that we actually need more ease. You can never have enough ease. So we need to account for emotion and we need to account for evolution. And this again is a perspective that I've always taken in my own studies. So today I think was very appropriate, both for this reason, but also because the last time I was in this room, it was at the invitation of this center, and it was about a workshop on embodiment. And today I'll show you some of my latest research, and that was just submitted to a special issue, focusing on issues of emotional contagion and embodiment. So let's start at the beginning. I study ritual. I've studied ritual my entire adult life, my entire academic life. Ritual has been seen as one of the foundations of society by many ritual theorists. People like Roy Rappaport call it the basic social act, the social act basic to humanity. And others like Durkheim argued that ritual is fundamental to the creation not only of religion, but of society itself. And if you think about it, when is a group truly a group? When is a family truly a family? When do all the members of an extended family come together? It is to perform some wedding or partake in a funeral or some other holiday. When do all the members of a university community come together? It's to attend the graduation ceremony. When do football fans ever come together as a body of fans? It is to perform those highly choreographed, deeply embodied, ritualized actions that we see in the terraces. And I think Durkheim would have approved of that phrase. He didn't use the language of embodiment, but I think his theory deeply speaks to it. The very act of congregating. I think we use a different translation of Durkheim, but the meaning is the same. The very act of congregating is an exceptionally powerful stimulant. Once the individuals are gathered together, there's this sort of electricity that he talked about that is generated from their closest and quickly launches them to an extraordinary height of exaltation. So he's making some important claims about embodied, enacted, embedded, and the extended nature of ritual. Because a collective emotion cannot be expressed collectively without some order that permits harmony and unison of movement, these gestures and cries tend to fall into rhythm and regularity. So the importance of rhythm and synchrony has been one of the areas of focus in my own research. And according to Durkheim, it is in these effervescent social settings and from this very effervescence that the religious idea seems to be born. And as I mentioned, he goes even further than that. For him, society as a whole is fundamentally rooted in those physical interactions, ritualized physical interactions. But the importance of rhythm and synchrony is something I've investigated and something we have in common with Emma. So we've done laboratory studies where we try to manipulate synchrony. In one of those studies, we had people respond to the beat of a metronome and perform specific actions. So they were never asked to synchronize, but we were able to manipulate synchrony because they thought they were syncing to a person in the next room via a video link, but they were actually syncing to a recording. And in one situation, in one condition, there was high synchrony because the person in that recording followed the beat precisely. And in the other condition, they were not very good at it. Think of it as dancing, engaging in a tango with somebody who's not a very good dancer and sometimes forgets the steps. That's what it was like. And then we measured a variety of outcomes. So we saw that those who were led to move in more synchronously, they liked each other more. They trusted each other more, not just verbally, but they actually trusted each other with their own money in an economic game, in a trust game. And we saw that as they were going through more and more repetitions of these choreographed sections, our pain thresholds increase, which suggests that perhaps an increase that's a proxy for the release of endorphins. We also talk about the possibility of the endocannabinoid system being in action here. In any case, we can't really measure those things directly because we'd have to drill a hole in the skull. So this is the best we can do. So we looked at the existing literature, and that's what we came up with. However, synchrony goes beyond just the passive empathic mirroring. So whenever I present some of those studies, people ask me, what about mirror neurons? And yes, of course, we know about mirror neurons, but there's more at play here. And we can see this in the context of collective rituals. It's a much more dynamical process. So I did my PhD studying firewalking rituals in Greece, Bulgaria, and later in Spain. And this is clearly a very highly arousing ritual. And in the context of my ethnographic work, I asked hundreds of people, why do you perform this ritual? And although all of them, without any exception, said that this was one of the most meaningful, one of the most important events in their lives, not just their religious lives, but their lives overall. When I asked them why they do those rituals, they just look at me, I go, what do you mean? That's what we do. That's who we are. It's fundamentally important to me. But it's hard to explain why. But of course, as anthropologists, that's why we emphasize participant observation rather than just giving people surveys. That's why we emphasize what happens, not just when you're sitting across a table with a recorder on, but at the bar and at the temple and in people's homes. So in those contexts, in those conversations, I would hear things that in my ears sounded very familiar, sounded very similar to what Durkheim would have to say about that. So they would say things like, the next day you see another firewalker in the street and you know you've been through this together, you've bonded, you have a different relationship to this person. You go through this, you feel part of a village. It's a sense of belonging and being one with the group. And there was this feeling of togetherness, this ineffable feeling, as people said, that keep coming up again and again. And I thought, okay, how can we possibly operationalize this? How can we measure this feeling of togetherness? How can we measure the emotional alignment that Durkheim had in mind? And Claire already gave you a teaser about this. So our is that we brought physiological monitors in that field site, and we measured people's heart rates, people's autonomic reactions. And what we saw was that there was a very high degree of synchrony. So here the red line is, well, the blue line is a firewalker, and the red line is somebody, it's his wife who is watching. And the three vertical lines is where the ritual begins, where his firewalk happens, and when his brother's firewalk happens. And you see that their physiological reactions are very much in synchrony. And the green line is somebody who's an outsider, a curious spectator, because there are 600 people living in that village, and there are 3,000 spectators that come to watch. Now, you don't see the same effects. So it's not just about automatic empathic mirroring. It's something fundamentally social. In fact, when we mapped the social network of this village, we could predict the level of synchrony based on the degree of social proximity. And this is how we did that. So these are recurrence plots. I'm going to get back to those plots. But basically, in those plots, you can see structure. The more structure you see there, the more synchrony is. I will come back to those plots. But here we're seeing on the left, a firewalker and his wife. In the middle, a firewalker and a friend. And to the right, a firewalker and an unrelated spectator. And you see that there, we basically see no structure. Another thing I did, and I like to do in my studies, is to what cognitive anthropologists often refer to as checking the psychological reality of our findings. So I started with phenomenology here. I moved to study something at the biological level. Now, does that make sense to my participants? So I went back to the village and I showed them my results. And a lot of them pointed to the graphs and they said, this makes sense to me. This is, do you remember when I said this cannot be expressed in words, how we feel during the ritual? This is how we feel. We feel like one. They mentioned things like resonance, which was curious to me because there were some of the same language that the physicists that we consulted in how to measure synchrony had brought up. Now, there are other aspects to this, and I added a couple of slides. These were not in my original presentation, but I added them as a response to Emma, or building up on Emma's points, but also because I thought, okay, this is what, 3 p.m. We've all had lunch. We might be feeling a bit sleepy, so let me do something about that. So this picture is from my current field site, Mauritius. I've been doing fieldwork there for 14 years, and I go back every year. And I chose to go to Mauritius precisely because some of the very high intensity rituals that take place there. Specifically among Indo-Mauritians, there's some Tamil Hindu rituals that involve a lot of physiological arousal, a lot of intense pain and suffering, and they're all voluntary. So in that context, we did studies that, for example, we found that people taking part in a ritual that involved prolonged exhaustion. So over the course of something like 8 hours, these people were walking under the burning sun, and then they would walk across the edges of knives, and then after that they would walk on fire. And we used physiological monitors again to see how much effort they exerted, and we see that the more effort, the less tired and the more euphoric they feel. Which again, to us, that is what prompted us to do that lab study, because it appears to be some effect of the runner's high, perhaps endorphin-mediated effect that follows prolonged exertion. And of course, endorphins are related to social bonding. By the way, something else I was not planning to talk about, but in the current study, we collected the data. We finished data collection about a couple of months ago, and we just looked at the data. We analyzed the data last week. So we did a study looking at perceptions of pain. And our conditions involve things like going through painful experiences alone versus in a group, or doing secular things versus ritual things in the context of religious rituals. So in one context, somebody has to make judgments about somebody who fasts for a specific amount of time, and in the control group, this person goes on a diet. Or they have to talk about somebody who walks a very long distance for a secular reason, or they walk a very long distance in the context of a pilgrimage, or they carry a very heavy object to the marketplace, or they carry a very heavy object in the context of the Kawadi ritual that involves doing that. And we consistently see that across all of these different activities, people tend to evaluate experiences that take place in collective settings as less painful and requiring less effort. And the same goes for ritual. So the ritualized activities are seen as less painful, even though they're exactly the same activities. And the motivation behind this was that I often heard my participants talk about this. So the firewalkers very often told me that if I step on a cigarette butt, I jump up and scream. But then I walk on fire and I don't feel the pain. So we see that this also applies to their perception of other people's actions, perhaps because they've experienced those themselves. We don't know, but further studies are needed. Anyway, if this picture seems even remotely bothersome to you, then you might want to look away for the next picture, because the rituals that I study in Mauritius, yeah, Pascal has seen that picture, involve things like this. So over the course of an entire day, people engage in what I can only describe as self-imposed torture. So the type of some Kawadi ritual involves piercing the body with hundreds of needles. Some of them have the entire body except for the genitals, putting skewers through the cheeks. And this hook right here is dragging a big chariot. Sometimes those chariots can be the size of minivans. So they're dragging those through their skin. And they're carrying those elaborate heavy structures. And at the end of the day, they have to climb a hill, carrying their burden. It's really an exceptionally painful ritual. So in the context of that ritual, that's the ritual that Claire mentioned, where we see that those engaging in more painful activities appear to become more prosocial. They donate more money to charity compared to taking part in less painful activities, which in turn, when they take part in those collective rituals, they're still more generous than baseline. Anyway, I entered those two studies just to build on what Emma had said. But let's go back to Durkheim. So what we're finding from our studies, when we look at the synchrony that goes beyond sort of automatic empathic mirroring, we're realizing that effervescence is fundamentally communal. And I think Durkheim would have agreed with that. It doesn't merely generate emotions, but it brings those who share them into a more intimate and more dynamic relationship. But how does it do that? And this is the context of the current study that I want to talk about. So in this study, we wanted to see just how this emotional contagion works. In the context of a ritual, there can be at least 3 different mechanisms. And I want to emphasize from the outset that those are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I think that they probably all have a role to play. Now, rituals often actively induce synchrony. We see this in many rituals. Music and dancing is one of the sort of most ancient forms of ritual and something that is included in most religious and secular rituals today. But how are emotions spread in those contexts? So one potential idea is that people are following a leader, perhaps a religious leader, a charismatic leader who's setting the tone for the ritual. Another idea is that people are synchronizing to the nearest neighbors. And this is behavior that we see in flocks of birds, for example. And a third possibility is that people are synchronizing to the structure of the ritual itself, especially as these people have a lot of experience performing this ritual. Can we distinguish between those 3 possibilities? And this is the current study. So for that, we looked at a ritual that we thought was appropriate. This is a study led by my graduate student, Mohammed Sarai. And we looked at the context of the Salat al-Jama'ah, which is a group prayer performed in congregation, during which participants will stand in parallel rows behind the religious leader, the imam, and facing the same direction towards the Mecca. And they perform these repetitive cycles of bows and prostrations while reciting prayers. And when we're designing that study, that led us to look into into Islamic scriptures. And boy, was that a treat. Obviously, those were written before Durkheim's time and before Damasius and Barcelo's time. But I think those read like a manual for embodiment. So people, even if they're unarticulated, people have intuitions about what a good ritual should be like. And there's some things that are more important than others. So in the scriptures, there's a lot of theological debate actually about just how many more rewards you get for performing prayer in congregation than doing it alone. Some say it's 25 times more, some say it's 27 times more, but they all agree doing a ritual as a group is fundamentally more important in the eyes of Allah than doing it alone. And the prayer performed by 10 people or more will bring countless rewards. So there's a threshold after which the rewards are even infinite. One prayer of a man in congregation is worthy than his 40 years of prayers at home. What is more, in those scriptures, the role of the body is very strictly defined. So the prayer itself consists of repetitive units, rak'ah, and each rak'ah includes a precise sequence: standing upright, bowing at a 90-degree angle with hands on your knees, standing upright, again, full prostration, and then sitting with legs folded under the body, and then you go into the next cycle, and so on and so forth. Any deviation from those rules will invalidate the prayer. This is very explicitly stated in some of the hadith. Bowing must be performed by bending the body at 90 degrees at the waist without tilting to the side and without bending the knees. During prostration, your forehead your knees, the palms of your feet, the palms of your hands, and your toes must all be touching the ground. If they're not, the prayer is invalid. And of course, no one should stand in front of the imam. And so the position of each body relative to another body is also very precisely prescribed. Any worshiper must be located behind the imam at a distance no longer than a person's largest normal step. And every subsequent worshiper may be linked to the imam either directly or through another person at the same length. And the grid should have no gaps. Everybody should be connected without obstructions. If there's a pillar in front of you and you can't see the others, your prayer is invalid. An exception for this is women, because in most Islamic contexts, there's segregation. So there's either a different room or there's a partition between them. But for within the group of women, the same rules of connectivity also apply. So in this context, we wanted to measure synchrony, and we wanted to measure two types of synchrony. First, the synchrony of behaviors, and then the synchrony of emotions. So we used a chest strap that included two devices. One of those devices has an accelerometer, and that accelerometer, it's a triaxial accelerometer that produces a metric of posture measured as plus or minus 180 degrees from vertical. And we also measured heart rate. And we also took advantage of a device that was created during COVID. It's called the Safe Spacer. The purpose of this device was to make people antisocial by making sure they had at least 6 feet distance between them. And if you came close, you could set it to beep. But I thought this was an opportunity. So I bought those devices and used them to measure social proximity and deactivated the beep. So in this context, we have different types of pairs. We have pairs who are co-located with the imam, the group of men. And we have pairs that are nearest neighbors, and that is measured through the Safe Spacer. So a nearest neighbor here is anybody who's within a range of 2 meters from each other. And of course, we have segregated pairs, men and women, and we have mixed pairs. As for the analysis we use cross-recurrence quantification analysis. This is the same methodology we used in Spain to operationalize synchrony. It's a deceptively simple method. Basically, on the left, you see that you plot two timelines as they evolve over time. And every time there's a recurrence, so when you see the same value or a similar value, you decide on the range, then you have a black square. And zooming out, that's what the full recurrence plots look like. So you can actually see with your own eyes when there's more or less structure, but you can also extract measurements, things like recurrence, the percentage of dots that are actually recurring, and determinism. How many of the prior states of the system predict future states of the system? So it tells us something about the rigidity and the determinism of the system. And you can also compare the diagonals that will give you a sense of whether there's a leader-follower scenario. So whether one particular timeline precedes the other. And with the Safe Spacer data, with a network analysis, we created a shortest path analysis to obtain a distance matrix between all pairs. So we knew who were nearest neighbors and we knew who was connected to whom. So about our question, what do they actually sync to? Do they sync to the imam, the charismatic leader? Do they sync to their nearest neighbors? Or do they sync to the structure of the ritual? So that would be simply the average. What we find is that when we look at posture, and this was initially unexpected, but later made a lot of sense to us. People sync directly to their nearest neighbors. That's not the unexpected part. The unexpected part is that the imam here has a negative value. And when it comes to emotional reactions, then we see that people sync to the imam. So that was very intriguing to us, and we did further analysis, and that's where we used these sort of delayed recurrence plots, which allowed us to see whether there's a leader-follower scenario. And in fact, what we see is that the imam is leading 96% of all participants in posture and 70% of all participants in heart rate. And that's why we don't have synchrony, precise synchrony, because everybody's actually following the imam. And moreover, what we find is that when we look at the network metrics, we see that for each step, they are removed from one another, the lower the synchrony. So we have a ripple effect. And that applies both to the posture measures, to the behavior, and to the emotional measures, the heart rates. So we see there are multiple processes at play here. Postural alignment is more localized. Physiological alignment operates on a broader scale, and the role of the central leader is fundamental to both. This is current research, so we have a lot of more questions to explore. A, whether that generalizes. This comes from a single prayer. B, do these effects scale up? There are religious festivals that have millions of participants. How does emotional contagion work in those contexts? Some of the rituals that I study in Mauritius, they involve large groups walking in procession. And currently we're doing a study where preliminary data suggests that the closer people are to one another in the procession, the closer their emotional reaction. So again, there we see that emotional reactions spread. And this is something that from an ethnographic perspective, I can also see with my own eyes. When the first person falls into trance, the person next to them is more likely to fall into trance than a person far away. So emotional reactions and the dancing and the screaming and all of those reactions that you have in the procession, they move like a wave. So we're trying to quantify that. Another important question is what's the role of individual differences? So for example, when I mentioned that people might be attuning to the structure of the ritual itself, that comes through experience. So we need a better understanding of how experienced people are in performing those rituals and whether that actually helps them increase synchrony and whether that makes them better at both transmitting and mimicking emotions from others. And of course, what are the physiological and the social ramifications of this? We went into some of that, and how do they extend to other phenomena? And that's something else that Emma and I have in common, that we're also interested in things like sports. So trying to answer some of these questions. We recently did a study where we followed basketball fans at the University of Connecticut. We have one of the best basketball teams, both among men and women's college basketball. Our women are phenomenal. They're by far the best team in the world, but our men are pretty good too, and the standing champions. So in this context, we followed fans for an entire year as they would go into the games, and other groups of fans as they would watch those games live on television. So the first question we wanted to ask was whether there was something fundamentally different about the raw physical experience of watching an event. So are there emotional reactions and the way they're synchronized to one another? Is that a function of the structure of the game? Is it just because some games are more exciting than others? Or is there something about the raw physicality of the event? This was a study we did just before COVID, but I think it became more salient during COVID, because what we find is that in-person events, in the context of sports at least, are very different than virtual events. And that's something that all of us know. I mean, there's a reason you paid a lot of money to fly people in and give them food and have them interact physically rather than just having this online, right? So we see that in an in-person setting, groups of people synchronize more their emotional reactions more than they do in a group setting online. And we see that that synchrony predicts their experience of the game. They have a more meaningful experience of the game, and that in turn predicts how bonded they feel. And I think that can have important implications. You talked about this click among players. I'm also interested in the click among fans. This is one of the current phenomena that we're studying in Brazil. Let's see if I can have sound for this. when I show this video to my students and I ask them what's going on, they very often think that they're about to attack the bus that is about to come. But what they're actually doing is they're trying to animate and motivate the players of the team before going into the stadium. So in this context, we collected physiological responses from the fans and also from members of the team who are riding the bus. And we want to see how this contributes to the experience of the game for better and for worse. So that click, this is something I have personally felt through my own experience. When I look at these phenomena, they look perfectly normal to me because that's what happens on a Sunday in Greece. And when you're part of that crowd of 30,000 people chanting in synchrony, you get those goosebumps that Durkheim referred to. You get the collective effervescence. But sometimes there's a small step between the upside of collective effervescence. I think Claire had a question related to that. So any group is defined by not only who's in it, but by also who's excluded from it. So there's a small distance between this kind of collective effervescence, the good kind, and things like we might have seen on January 6th, or in hooliganism in sporting events, or at a Nazi rally. Can we perhaps predict those events by looking at crowd dynamics? I think this is, we have unprecedented opportunities, as so many people now have wearables that give us physiological reactions on them, and very soon everybody will have those. And things like machine learning are also helping us quantify some of the things and understand some of those processes. Can we say something? And I think we can, because we can even say something intuitively. We might not even know what it is. Many years ago, I was living in San Sebastian in Spain, where my girlfriend, who's now my wife, was doing her internship as a journalist. And she was asked to cover an ETA demonstration. And I don't know how many of you know about ETA. It's a separatist organization in the Basque Country and in the past, there's been a lot of violence, both towards that group and coming from their group. And when you heard about an ETA demonstration, that was something to be afraid of. That was not something good. Things could go wrong. And people could lose their lives. And so she asked me to join her. She says, can you come for moral support? I've never been in this context. I'm scared. So I went with her to cover the event. And at some point during the demonstration, which people were just marching and chanting, and I said, I grabbed her by the hand and I said, let's get out of here. And she said, why? And I said, just run. And just seconds later, somebody threw a rock at the police, and then the police responded with tear gas, and there was blood and there was violence. And later she asked me, how the hell did you know? I didn't see anything. And I said, well, I don't know what I saw, but I knew what I saw. I knew that I saw it because I'm familiar with the Greek football stadium situation. And I've seen that kind of violence erupt. I've seen collective effervescence turn into something dangerous. So, a very ambitious goal of this program would be to be able to say something about those types of events, and perhaps if we can be very ambitious to maybe even predict them. And I'll close with a note of thanks to all of my collaborators. All of these studies are radically interdisciplinary and very collaborative. So we need, tons of people are involved, and these are just a few of them. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask your, leading guess about this transition from mere collective effervescence to violence. Do you think having an outlet like football for collective effervescence, it's like an outlet and it kind of channels some of the energy away, so it's less likely to happen in, say, political contexts? Or is it sort of like a rehearsal that will make the transition to violence more likely in political contexts, or other potentially violent contexts?
So historically, I think that ritual has played that role as an outlet. And I'm reminded of a ritual I once saw in Madagascar. I was there not doing field work, but I was just visiting, and we had a local guide. And at some point, we were in a village deep in the tribal areas, and I saw a commotion. There was a group of people, and they had formed a circle. And inside the circle, there were smaller circles of people who seemed to be arranged by sex and age cohort. And then occasionally, somebody from the outer circle would just look at them and challenge them to a fight. And then they would really go at it. They would exchange punches right in the face. And there was a referee that would step in and separate them. And the thing that struck me the most was that at the end of this event, everybody was jolly. So that's the kind of ritual, and in the ethnographic record, it's full of those sorts of rituals. So you have song duels among the Inuit, for example, where people exchange punches to settle their differences, and then that's it. And I think a lot of this sports do play this kind of role, but I think there's also something to be said about scale. And I think that when collective emotions are high, there's a certain threshold. I don't know where that threshold is. That when you cross the threshold of arousal in a large-scale group, I think things can become uncontrollable because the referee is no longer there.
I wanted to know if you had more to say about, I guess, like paired effervescences. So with like football hooliganism and the ETA demonstration, there's kind of this contrary groups with the police and the ETA, and then maybe the opposing team and the hooligan. And then you have a different kind of effervescence where maybe in the prayer circle where it's not really towards another group, or in like a musical concert or like an evangelical megachurch, there's not like another group where, because I feel like when you said like the protests are first through the rock, it was like it bounced back and forth until the whole crowd kind of erupted. And I imagine something similar happens with hooliganism. So I was wondering if you think that kind of the antagonism in effervescence is some part necessary for elevating from mere to violence.
I think that points to the role of doctrine and ideology that you see. You can see that both in religion and in politics and even in sports. I think the structure of the events is largely identical. So think of the haka dance. I've seen the haka being performed as a welcoming ritual. It's also a war dance. The hossa among Shia Muslims is very similar. It can be performed to honor somebody, but it can also be performed to rally people and get them to fight. And I think that's why religion has been historically so successful at harnessing the potential of ritual. Because once you have flags and different color T-shirts and ideologies, then I think it's very easy to cross the tipping point. As I said, there's no group is, by definition, every group is defined not only by who it includes, but also by who is excluded. And demagogues, populists know this very well. Politicians, the easiest way to sometimes to bring a group together and create internal cohesion is by creating an enemy. And ideology does that.
Thank you for that talk. Wonderful. So just when you're both talking there, I'm also thinking about classic anthropological texts and costly signaling and group formation. And my mother died 3 years ago, and I can tell you every single person who was there, and I can also tell you key people who didn't show up. And so that leads me to the question that I had, which is, you and Em also I know you've talked about pain and the perception of pain, but you've mainly focused on euphoric, positively valenced emotions, excitement, right? And so I wonder theoretically, as you know, I'm interested in grief rituals, and we did a project in London when Queen Elizabeth died, and we're doing some stuff in Tanatraja. So I'm really interested in grief rituals, but grief rituals, I would predict, and I'm wondering, my question is the valence of the emotion, crucial, or could it be a dysphoric emotion where heart rates are slower, where you see evidence of sadness, do you think that also serves a similar function, or is the kind of emotion key to the
Yeah,
effervescence?
and that's something we often discuss in connection to.
Yeah, but we
the
can't do a
scenery.
study because we won't get ethical approval
well,
to
there-
kill someone.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm tempted to say that it's not about valence, it's about intensity, but it also just so happens that negatively balanced situations and rituals tend to be more intense. It's really hard to compare, the loss of a human being to anything, to the most euphoric thing you can imagine, right? So I don't know per se what that means. So how would we? So it is difficult. I mean, if we could, how could we create equally, positive and negatively balanced rituals of equal intensity? I think it's a. Is that, are these commensurate? Like, do somebody dying and then just, a new boyfriend, or I don't know. Yeah, it's, but it's, no, it's definitely a question worth asking, and I ask that question all the time, and I kind of oscillate between the two answers. It's hard.
Yes, I was just curious in the element of size dynamics, and particularly group size, of course, and of course, in an Islamic congregation, often you can go from a minimum of 2, an imam and a mamun, all the way up to thousands of congregation members, and any sporting event can comprise any number of participants. And I was curious where you saw the role of group size as a constraint to actually a facilitator of.
I hope to have this answer for you in a few years. So we're doing 2 different studies. One is we're looking at with some graduate students at UConn. We're looking at low arousal events that involve synchrony, so yoga practices, where we're varying the group size, and we're also looking at religious events in Mauritius, where we're just sampling from events that vary from something like 20 people to 3,000 people. So yeah, it is definitely something that I'm asking, and I don't have the answer yet, but maybe I'll get back to you.